I never thought I'd be that guy, posting on the internet looking for advice about my train wreck of a marriage. I guess this is what rock bottom feels like. I'm Mike, 44 years old, and I've been married to Emily for what I thought were 17 solid years. Turns out they weren't as solid as I thought. We've got a teenage son, Jake, who's 16 now. I always thought we had a pretty decent life. Nothing extravagant, just normal. We bought a house in the suburbs, had backyard BBQs, family vacations to the beach, all that cliché stuff. But here's the thing. Emily always had this fiery personality. She'd say whatever was on her mind, no filter, and I used to admire that. She was strong, independent, and in the early days of our marriage, I thought that fire was what made us work so well. She kept me on my toes, challenged me, made me laugh. But over the last few months, that fire wasn't directed at the world anymore. It was pointed squarely at me. And not in a good way. Started small, like these things usually do, right? She'd roll her eyes at me more than usual or brush me off when I try to make conversation. Fine, people get stressed. Work's a bitch sometimes, and I get it. But then it got worse. Emily started staying out late, coming home at odd hours. She'd say it was work, but I knew better. She's a nurse, for God's sake. No job has you working until 11 p.m. on random weekdays without some kind of explanation. I'd ask her about it, but she always had a way of turning things around, making me feel like the bad guy for even questioning her. And then there was her phone, constantly glued to her hand, notifications popping up nonstop, but anytime I came near her, she'd tilt the screen away or shove it in her pocket like she had something to hide. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I mean, we've got 17 years under our belt, a son, a whole life together. You don't just throw that away over... Well, you get the idea. But it was becoming impossible to ignore. I couldn't shake this nagging feeling in my gut that something was seriously wrong. I just didn't know how bad it was yet. The turning point was my birthday of all days. I'd been looking forward to it, even though things had been tense between us lately. I figured a small party at home, just the three of us and maybe a couple of close friends, might help lighten the mood. I even invited our neighbor, David, a guy I thought was a friend. He lived next door with his wife and 2 little kids. He'd come over a lot to hang out, have a beer, watch a game. You know, guy stuff. I didn't think much of it. Just a friendly neighbor who was always around. Turns out he was a little too friendly with my wife. The day of the party, Emily was in a weirdly good mood, which threw me off. I couldn't remember the last time she actually smiled at me like that. She was dressed up, more than usual, like she was really trying to impress someone. At first, I thought maybe she was making an effort because she knew things had been strained between us. Stupid, I know. But I still wanted to believe there was something left to save. Everything seemed fine at first, but the more I watched Emily, the more I noticed she wasn't exactly paying attention to me. Her eyes kept wandering over to David, who was sitting in the corner of the living room with his beer. She'd laugh a little too loud at his jokes, and when I wasn't looking, I'd catch her leaning in closer to him. At one point, I noticed her hand graze his arm, and something inside me just snapped. I tried to play it cool. I didn't want to cause a scene at my own birthday party, especially in front of Jake. But every second that passed felt like an eternity, and I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted her, right there in front of everyone. I didn't care about being subtle. I turned to her and said, "What the hell is going on with you two?" I'll never forget the way she looked at me, completely unbothered, like I was the one overreacting. She didn't even try to hide it. She smirked, took a sip of her drink and said, "He's been more of a husband to me than you ever were in our 17 years of marriage." Just like that, like it was no big deal. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My heart was racing. My hands were shaking. But what she said next hit even harder. Jake, my own son, overheard everything and jumped in before I could even respond. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Dad, don't bother asking questions. He's been spending more nights here than you." It was like a punch in the gut. My own kid had been in on it, and I had been completely blind. I didn't know what to say. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me, waiting to see how I'd react. The humiliation was unbearable. I was standing there in my own house on my birthday, finding out my wife had been sneaking around with the guy next door, and my son knew about it. I felt like my entire world had collapsed in an instant. The room was spinning. I couldn't believe what had just come out of their mouths. Emily, still sitting there so smug, didn't even flinch when I confronted her in front of everyone. I could feel the anger bubbling up, threatening to explode, but I didn't want to lose it in front of everyone, especially Jake. So I took a deep breath, tried to collect myself, and asked, "How long, Emily? How long has this been going on?" She gave me this sideways glance, like I was the idiot in the situation. "Oh, Mike," she sighed dramatically, as if she were bored of the whole thing. "You're so dense sometimes. This has been going on for months, maybe even a year. Who's counting?" She laughed, and David had the audacity to chuckle along with her. I felt my fists clench at my sides. How could she be so heartless, so casual about it? This wasn't just some fling. It was our life, our marriage, and she was tossing it aside like it was nothing. "And you," I pointed at David, my so-called friend, "you've been coming into my house, acting like everything's fine, all while sneaking around with my wife?" David had the nerve to stand up, looking more irritated than apologetic. "Look, Mike, you've been checked out for a long time. It's not my fault you didn't see what was happening. I didn't force anything." Emily came to me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to punch him, knock that smug look off his face, but then Jake chimed in again, making everything worse. "Dad, you haven't been around. You're always at work or locked away in your garage. It's not like you've been much of a dad or husband anyway." That was the final blow. I stared at my son, speechless. I knew I'd been busy, but I always thought I was working hard for our family. Now, hearing him say that, it felt like I'd failed in every possible way as a husband, as a father. Emily just shrugged and said, "Mike, you've been a ghost in this marriage for years. I got tired of waiting for you to notice." I stood there, feeling like a complete fool, watching as my entire world disintegrated in front of me. The hours after the confrontation were a blur. I felt a mix of shock, betrayal, anger, and the worst kind of sadness. I couldn't even process it all at once. It was like my brain shut down to protect itself. I went outside to get some air, but it didn't help. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my heart felt like it was being crushed in a vice. How had I been so blind? How had I not noticed what was happening right under my nose? I mean, looking back, the signs were all there. The late nights, the phone she guarded like it held state secrets, the way she had completely stopped caring about anything I did. But I had been so busy trying to hold everything together, I didn't see that she was actively tearing it all apart. I went to the garage to be alone. It's always been my space, where I could think or just escape for a bit. I thought maybe being in there would help me clear my head. But as I sat there, all I could see were flashes of what had happened. Emily's smirk, Jake's betrayal, David acting like I was the fool for not seeing it sooner. My hands found an old crowbar I kept for house repairs, and in that moment, the rage was overwhelming. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I walked back into the house, my mind spinning with fury and heartbreak. Emily was sitting on the couch, casually talking to David like they hadn't just shattered my entire world. Jake was upstairs, probably thinking everything would blow over. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I didn't say a word as I picked up the family photo that had been hanging on the wall for years. I smashed it on the floor, glass flying everywhere. That got their attention. Emily jumped up, and David looked genuinely scared for the first time that night. Good. I wanted them to feel the fear. I wanted them to understand the pain they had caused. "I'm done," I said, my voice cold and calm in a way that surprised even me. "You want to throw away 17 years for this piece of trash?" I pointed at David, who looked like he wanted to disappear. "Fine, but you're not going to do it in my house, not on my time." I grabbed David by the collar and dragged him to the front door. He didn't even try to fight back. I threw him out onto the lawn and said, Don't ever come near my house again. If I see you here, I'll make sure you regret it." Emily started to say something, but I cut her off. "You're next," I told her. "Pack your things and get out. This marriage is over, and I'm not waiting around for you to figure out what you want. You've made your choice." She tried to argue, saying I was overreacting, that we could work things out. Can you believe that? After everything she had done, she still had the nerve to think I'd give her another chance. "No, Emily, you made your bed. Now lie in it. I want you out of here by tomorrow, and I'm filing for divorce." That night, Jake came downstairs, finally realizing how serious things were. He looked at me like he expected some kind of forgiveness or understanding. "Dad, I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice small and unsure. I thought you didn't care anymore." I couldn't even look at him. My own son had known what was happening and hadn't said a word. He'd let me walk around like a fool, defending a marriage that was already dead. "Jake, you're 16, not 6. You knew what was going on, and you chose to side with her. That's something I'm not sure I can ever forgive." He looked like I'd slapped him, but I didn't care. I wasn't in the mood to coddle him. He had betrayed me, too. The one person I thought I could count on had turned against me, and it broke something inside me. I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. The next morning, Emily was gone. She'd packed a few bags and left without a word. I didn't care where she went. I was done with her. As soon as she was out of the house, I called a lawyer. I wasn't going to let her drag this out or make me jump through hoops. I wanted a clean break, full custody of Jake, even though I didn't know how I felt about him yet. And the house. She wasn't going to take anything else from me. It took everything I had to get through the legal process. Emily fought back, of course, trying to get half of everything, but I wasn't going to let her win. In the end, I got the house, most of the savings, and joint custody of Jake. I didn't care what happened to her after that. As far as I was concerned, she was just a bad memory now. In the weeks that followed, I went through every possible emotion. Anger, sadness, guilt, even relief. It felt like I had been living in a nightmare for months, and now I was finally waking up. But waking up didn't mean the pain was gone. I had to rebuild my life from the ground up, and some days that felt impossible. Jake and I started talking again. Slowly. I didn't trust him the way I used to, but he's still my son. I couldn't just shut him out completely. It's going to take time, and I don't know if things will ever be the same between us. But I'm trying. That's all I can do. Looking back, I see now how blind I was. I was so focused on keeping everything together, I didn't see the cracks forming until it was too late. Emily was a liar, a manipulator, and frankly, a complete bitch who didn't deserve the years I gave her. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: you can't force someone to love you, and you can't ignore the signs when things start to fall apart. If anyone reading this is going through something similar, my advice is simple: trust your gut. Don't wait until your world collapses to face the truth. And if someone betrays you, don't waste your time trying to fix things. Walk away.